Next slide, please. So maybe we're kind of moving from a place where we're moving kind of like private capital driving things to public capital, and that means kind of like a state that's less laissez-faire and more proactive in actually shaping markets and determining what this looks like. Okay, next slide, please. This is all happening right now. Next slide. We've been doing a map of digital public infrastructure as it exists around the world. We found a large number of digital identity systems, a number of countries with payment systems, and a huge number of countries experimenting and trying to do data exchanges. If you go to the next map, you can go to dpimap.org to see some of our work, and you can touch on a country like, say, South Africa, and see what we've learned about what's happening here, and also email us if you think that we have anything wrong. Okay, going to close out with where I think this matters to ministries of finance. Next slide, please. So if we are moving from this kind of traditional digitization where we're doing these vertically silos where there's a lot of duplication, and we're moving to a world of kind of a sovereign stack where we're thinking about shared infrastructure that we think delivers better services but is also happens to maybe be more cost effective. Next slide, please. What's that mean? So I think for ministries of finance, my team and I, so Beatrice who's sitting over there, a large number of us are trying to think about what are the economic impacts, both good and bad, of this type of model, and trying to imagine what are the direct benefits of doing this type of work, what are the kind of the dynamic and what are the market shaping and the spillover effects of taking this approach. And if we go to the next slide, you know, there are three that come to mind to me. So one is there is an efficiency argument to be made. So next slide. If you think about, like, say, Estonia, which has organized its data and has single sources of truth, what becomes much easier for them is, next slide, please, every time they want to share data between two ministries, they don't have to go and negotiate an MOU between those two ministries to share data. You know, you as finance colleagues, if you look across your government, there's like an infinite number of MOUs around data sharing that currently exist between the ministries and your government. Every single one of those requires a whole bunch of lawyers to get in the room. Every single one of those requires a new custom agreement to be created. Every one of them requires some sort of like oversight or, you know, checking every few years to make sure they're being like complied with. Then the ministries are behaving to each other. Like the colossal waste of all of this time and energy just to share data between two agencies. And what the Estonians have effectively done by getting their data organized is they've standardized the MOU. So if you go to the next slide, what they've really done is said, no, there's a single form of MOU that everybody adheres to, and we'll encode that MOU into our software to make sharing basically seamless. So if you are sharing, you are in compliance with our standardized MOU. Next slide, please. That's what I think the Estonians have done that's so interesting and makes their model so efficient. Next slide, please. And they are kind of like, actually, I will not share what the impact is because we'll do that this afternoon. Ministries of finance kind of tell us that they kind of value these three things. So let's just scroll through these to the full slide. They say they value frugality. Next, please. Just keep going until the entire slide's full. They say they value efficiency, that they want scale and operability, and they want accountability. I think that that's super interesting. But when it comes to thinking about how governments procure technology, the Ministry of Finance feel like they're totally silent on all three of these things. They have no opinion. And if you go to the next slide, like what I'm wondering is, your ministries of finance, you in this room, you effectively determine what the shape of government looks like. Because if we now live in a digital era, and every service we offer is being hardwired into a technology because that's how we're delivering it to our citizens, then what we choose to procure and what we choose to build to manifest those services is what government looks like. And so right now, go to the next slide, it's cool. So what right now you're doing is you are choosing to fund monolith after monolith after monolith of what I would argue is a relatively inefficient approach. And I'd like to know why. And that's one of the things, next slide please, that's one of the things we're going to talk about this afternoon during the session that Beatrice and I will be running. This is some work that I'm doing along with a colleague, Diane Coyle at University of Cambridge, to try to kind of interrogate ministries of finance to learn what capabilities would they want and does this conversation interest them? Because again, I think maybe you can't assert control, but ministries of finance are a blocker and a determinant about what the structure and shape of government looks like. Next slide, please. So in summary, there isn't going to be enough money for us to do digital transformation and all the other things we want to do, so we got to find some new models. I think DPI capabilities are an emergent and interesting way of thinking about doing this. The costs and benefits of doing that are also emergent, but we're trying to discover what those are. But there's been some real wins, and you can learn more about those this afternoon. But ministries of finance seem to be blockers in this process, and I'd like to uncover why that's the case and what we can do about it. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, David. One quick follow-up question, if I may. That was helpful to kind of lift us up in the conversation, perhaps to dive down a little bit again, and just because there's no end of terminology in this space. So I wondered if you could quickly sort of give a sense of how for you this infrastructure thinking and DPI terminology differs from some of the other terminology people might hear of sort of GovStack initiatives, government as a platform, GovTech.
Thank you. That's a great question, because I do think you can get lost. So I think so for example, some of you may have heard of GovStack. I think GovStack is one way of trying to is a way that people are trying to organize the infrastructure around a set of standards and kind of components that are interoperable to kind of provide people a solution for thinking about how to implement digital public infrastructure. So I see it as like, they're not a vendor, they're kind of a set of standards that are trying to help governments understand and facilitate a journey towards implementing digital public infrastructure. I think government as a platform was a term that we used to use to describe this, and then the Indians came along at the G20 and made digital public infrastructure a term that a lot more people knew. So we were like, okay, we will stop using that term and start using that term because the Indians have done so much great work, and we just all happily went along with that. But I kind of see them as being generally equivalent.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to come back to later. But moving on, Mr. Ouedraogo, I want to invite you to tell us about how the Ministry of Finance in Burkina Faso is thinking about its role in digital transformation. Kind of what do you do at the moment, and how are you anticipating that evolving over the coming years?
Alors, merci. Donc, je disais que chez nous, au Burkina Faso, effectivement, le ministère en charge des Finances est au cœur de l'ensemble des réformes, notamment celles qui concernent le numérique. Bien que, je dois dire que historiquement, tout ce qui concerne le numérique a commencé au niveau du ministère des Finances, parce que c'est ce ministère-là qui avait les applications métiers sensibles. Donc, l'informatique a commencé au niveau du ministère des Finances. Mais je dois dire que par la suite, et aujourd'hui, il y a un autre ministère dédié à la transition digitale. Mais le ministère des Finances travaille en étroite collaboration avec ce ministère-là afin que cette réforme sur la numérisation puisse avoir un succès. Et donc, pour le rôle du ministère des Finances, on se rappelle que le ministère des Finances, c'est celui qui a en charge la mise en œuvre de la politique de l'État à travers l'outil privilégié qu'est le budget. Donc, la manière d'allouer le budget à tel ou tel secteur permet d'avoir focus sur ce secteur-là. Et comme actuellement, on sait que le numérique est vraiment indispensable, c'est le rôle du ministère des Finances, c'est on peut dire à deux niveaux. Le premier niveau, c'est d'abord de faire en sorte que le premier package qui consiste à mettre en place des outils numériques pour la gestion des finances publiques au niveau central, qui va déboucher à faire en sorte que les autres sectoriels puissent avoir les ressources nécessaires pour faire face à leur mission, que ce package-là soit un succès. Et dans ce cadre-là, aussi bien au niveau de la fiscalité, au niveau de la gestion budgétaire, le ministère en charge des Finances a entrepris des réformes pour mettre en œuvre au niveau de ces secteurs-là vraiment des outils numériques adaptés permettant d'avoir une gestion efficace des finances publiques. Ainsi donc, au niveau de la fiscalité, actuellement, on a entrepris des réformes au niveau des impôts à travers e-syntax et toutes les applications numérisées qui vont avec. Au niveau de la douane, on vient de mettre en œuvre tout à l'heure e-douane qui permet de télédéclarer et de télépayer en matière douanière. Au niveau de la gestion budgétaire, aussi bien budgétaire que comptable, on est en train de mettre en œuvre, avec l'appui de la Banque mondiale au départ, le système intégré qu'on appelle chez nous le SI-NAFOLO, qui permet de gérer l'élaboration du budget, son exécution et son compte-rendu. Alors, cela fait que, une fois que l'ensemble de ce premier package qui permet d'avoir une bonne gestion des finances publiques est mis en œuvre, on passe maintenant à l'accompagnement des autres secteurs pour qu'on puisse, in fine, utiliser les ressources mises à leur disposition là pour impacter la vie de la population. Et cela se fait à travers d'abord l'exemple même au niveau du ministère des Finances, parce que le ministère, à travers la mise en œuvre de la politique du secteur financier, met en œuvre des applications qui permettent d'avoir l'impact pour faciliter la vie au quotidien des citoyens. On peut citer au niveau de la fiscalité, comme j'ai dit, e-syntax, qui permet à l'ensemble des acteurs de télédéclarer leurs impôts à partir de chez eux, de télépayer. Également, pour les fonctionnaires, par exemple, l'année passée, on a mis en place ce qu'on appelle l'application e-bulletin, qui permet à l'ensemble des agents qui sont payés par l'État de vérifier et d'avoir leur bulletin de paie à travers Internet. Voilà. Donc, avant, si les acteurs voulaient, par exemple, faire des prêts, ils sont obligés de laisser leur poste à des milliers de kilomètres parfois pour revenir à la capitale pour chercher le bulletin qui est l'outil qui permet de voir quel est le gain qu'on attribue aux fonctionnaires, et c'est sur cette base qu'on va faire le prêt. Et désormais, à partir de son propre téléphone, on peut avoir la situation de son solde. Et également, les banques n'ont plus besoin de demander que l'agent vienne apporter la preuve de combien il gagne, parce qu'on a fait une interconnexion entre les banques et cette application-là qui permet aux banques de vérifier directement la situation du salarié pour procéder aux opérations sans avoir besoin de se déplacer. Également, pour ce qui concerne, hier on en a parlé lors du bazar, pour ce qui concerne par exemple la gestion des timbres, on a numérisé ces timbres-là pour faire en sorte qu'à tout moment, celui qui veut utiliser des timbres fiscaux puisse avoir accès à ces timbres-là. Donc, ça facilite. Donc, le ministère des Finances donne d'abord l'exemple par lui-même et également accompagne maintenant les autres ministères à travers les allocations budgétaires. Il y a également que l'année passée, le ministre des Finances a organisé ce qu'on appelle le concours de l'innovation pour primer les services qui auraient fait des innovations dans le secteur des finances publiques. Et c'est l'occasion d'interpeller également les autres sectoriels là pour aller dans ce sens. Voilà, donc pour résumer, je dirais que le ministère des Finances, à travers les allocations, c'est vrai que hier on a vu que les ressources c'est nécessaire, mais ça ne suffit pas parce qu'on a vu qu'on a mis de l'argent dans beaucoup de projets qui n'ont pas forcément abouti. Mais c'est d'abord c'est ce qui est nécessaire, même si ça ne suffit pas. Donc le ministère des Finances joue ce rôle-là à travers l'allocation des ressources et qui vont aller à la mise en œuvre des services numériques. Ensuite, le ministère des Finances donne l'exemple en faisant en sorte que lui-même, au sein du ministère, puisse aller vers la numérisation pour ce qui concerne le premier package qui permet de mettre les ressources à la disposition des ministères, mais également continue en faisant des e-services au niveau des services qu'il offre directement aux citoyens. Donc, voilà ce que je peux dire par rapport au rôle actuel du ministère des Finances dans ce processus-là. Merci.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I'm wondering, as you look at those reforms that you've put in place, what you might think the kind of what the opportunities are for where you go next with it. And so you talked at the end about the opportunity to work with other ministries, departments, agencies on improving their e-services. Clearly, there's a funding element to that, which the finance ministry is crucial for. But particularly thinking of some of what David was saying about this kind of horizontal capabilities and kind of looking across the picture, what you think the role of your Ministry of Finance might be in that in the next few years.
Alors, merci. Alors, comme j'ai dit, actuellement, le ministère des Finances joue son rôle régalien qui est la mise à la disposition des ressources au sectoriel pour pouvoir assurer leur mission. Mais avec la réforme, le ministère des Finances compte aller au-delà. Aujourd'hui, dans le numérique, l'élément important pour aller vers le schéma qu'on a vu tout à l'heure, c'est l'identifiant. Parce que si on veut faire l'intégration des données, il faut qu'on puisse pouvoir identifier de manière unique le citoyen. C'est vrai qu'actuellement, on a une réforme en cours qui n'est pas portée par le ministère des Finances, mais portée par le ministère en charge de la transition digitale pour permettre d'avoir une identification unique du citoyen pour aller vers l'efficacité vraiment des services numériques. Ensuite, l'autre aspect du schéma qu'on a vu, c'est l'aspect paiement. Et actuellement, le ministère en charge des Finances est en train de mettre en œuvre une plateforme numérique de paiement de l'État pour permettre à l'État d'avoir son propre portefeuille électronique, un projet qui s'appelle Faso Arzeka, qui va être peut-être lancé d'ici la fin de l'année et qui va également permettre à l'ensemble des acteurs de pouvoir faire les paiements, que ce soit pour les services et au niveau des autres services de l'État comme au niveau des autres services qui seront interconnectés, de faire des paiements électroniques. Ça permet d'éviter la circulation du cash et d'avoir plus d'efficience. Également, on envisage voir, comme on est en gestion axée sur les résultats, comment faire en sorte qu'on puisse allouer les ressources-là à travers une performance numérique. Je m'explique. Aujourd'hui, l'allocation des ressources se fait, comme on est en budget programme, se fait à travers l'efficacité, voyons la performance pour la première année par exemple, pour bénéficier des ressources pour la deuxième année. Normalement, l'allocation se fait sur la base de la performance. Alors, on est en train de réfléchir pour voir, pour accompagner ce numérique-là, est-ce qu'on ne peut pas faire une allocation des ressources via la performance côté numérique? C'est-à-dire que le ministère qui va recevoir les allocations l'année N ou la période des 3 ans, par exemple, pour mettre en place des services numériques, une fois qu'on va s'assurer que ce service est fait, mais surtout que ça a été efficace, que ça a apporté un plus dans le quotidien de la population, on va avoir un bonus ou accompagner davantage ce secteur-là pour aller encore vers d'autres services numériques. Ça va être une prime pour permettre de promouvoir et d'accompagner l'ensemble des autres sectoriels-là pour que, en tout cas d'ici 5-10 ans, on puisse arriver au package complet et également accompagner le ministère en charge de la transition digitale pour aller vers l'intégration des services. Parce qu'une fois que le projet d'identification va se terminer, il faut qu'on puisse accompagner l'ensemble des autres ministères pour faire l'intégration de l'ensemble de ces bases de données-là pour avoir, en tout cas, aboutir au schéma idéal, voilà, des infrastructures que peut offrir les infrastructures publiques numériques avec le gros package-là et l'interopérabilité entre l'ensemble de ces secteurs. Et on pense que si on arrive, parce qu'actuellement on a un projet avec la Banque mondiale qui s'appelle le Pacte digital, projet d'accélération de la digitalisation, une fois qu'on va arriver à la fin de ce projet-là, on pense qu'avec l'accompagnement du ministère en charge des Finances, avec le processus que j'ai donné, on peut en tout cas dans 5 ans ne plus parler des problèmes aujourd'hui comme on l'a dit hier, mais en tout cas avoir beaucoup plus d'avancées en la matière. Merci.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point to kind of come to about particularly the insight and situational awareness that sits in the finance ministry that can inform those initiatives. Moving on to Dr. Shoshwayo, so it's a big week for G20 conversations and handing the baton to South Africa. Hoping you could tell us a little about how thinking on South Africa's DPI agenda is evolving and the role that the National Treasury is playing within that and what's motivating the Treasury to take that role.
Thanks. So as South Africa, we're really at the start of our DPI journey. And I guess that's just reflective of the varying levels of technology maturity that have existed across different institutions and skill sets as well. So you've had a very fragmented approach and divergent approach across different institutions. So some are actually quite ahead of the curve and some are lagging behind. And what we've really missed is that central coordination within our digital transformation agenda. And that's really impacted the pace of digitization as a country, I'd say. We have multiple initiatives that are looking into creating digital IDs, digital payments, and data exchanges, which shows that there's a lot of duplication, a lot of overlaps in what different departments and institutions are trying to drive for themselves, because there hasn't been that central coordination. But what is important, I guess, to note as we start this journey and where we find ourselves is, one, just mapping what is working in South Africa, what we have in place, and identifying the key areas or pockets of success, you know, although they're also not without their challenges. So, for example, one of the use cases, or I guess the example, that's led or triggered the start of a coordinated approach to DPI would be emerging from the COVID-19 grant and having our SASSA agency have to administer grants virtual or electronically, and not being able to you know, unload on beneficiaries in person. They've had to transition to doing electronic enrollments, verifications, and payments. So I think that was a really great example of where SASSA, together with other government departments, were able to automate data exchange, use data across multiple systems, so SARS, UIF, the Department of Home Affairs, including the commercial banks, to be able to do means testing and employment testing, to be able to facilitate that process. So I think we then saw that, you know, even though it emerged out of a crisis, you can build on initiatives like that to develop the broader agenda. I also think, you know, coming back to the finance ministry, SARS would be a really great, our revenue authority is a really great example of those that are ahead of the curve. Within SARS, there have been a lot of initiatives to try and, you know, alleviate or make it easier for taxpayers to be able to submit their returns. They've undertaken an initiative, or one of their successful initiatives has been their auto assessments that they've put in place, where they assess about 5 million taxpayers by using data that they receive from different payrolls, from medical schemes, retirement schemes, and, you know, they use that to pre-populate and automate that process. And I think that just shows the efficiency that you can gain from being able to leverage technology and the use of AI and machine learning to be able to generate that information and pre-populate it into tax returns. And even within Treasury, I suppose we've also built a lot of different digital tools. And you know, we had a lot of them on display yesterday, but I think one that was missing that I'll highlight now would be our central supplier database as well, which has automated data exchange and verification with different entities. So when a company wants to do business with the state, they register on the CSD, and that is cross-checked with the CIPC, our company information registry, with SARS as well as banking information and other institutions, to be able to verify the people that are registering. And I guess that's why the presidency has been so important in us actually mapping out a lot of these areas of success that we've had and building and coordinating from the center of government, as you had mentioned in the opening. It's important to have that central coordination. We're doing it through, firstly, we've put digital transformation as a key priority under Operation Vulindlela, which is a joint initiative between National Treasury and the Presidency to support the implementation and fast tracking of structural reforms. And being able to put this onto that agenda means, I guess it shows as well, Treasury's interest in actually fast tracking implementation and unblocking any hurdles that would hinder us from being able to gain traction in implementing all of the recommendations that are going to come through this process. But through OV, we've then, for this particular initiative, we've created an interdepartmental working group, which is chaired by the DG of the Presidency, and it's co-chaired by the DG of the National Treasury, as well as the DG of Communications and Digital Technologies. So these three institutions are essentially really holding hands to navigate us and put together a roadmap that is going to map out our digital journey or our DPI journey over the next year, which comes at a timely point for us as we take over the G20 presidency. We're really keen to leverage all of the support that's being offered to South Africa in helping us craft that roadmap and forging the way forward. But I guess maybe I'll touch on this as well, because usually when we talk about DPI, it tends to be quite service delivery focused. Treasury is a policy department, and so for us, the data exchange component of things has been a real priority for us. We have an initiative that we're currently partnering with StatsSA on, which is the South Africa Integrated Data Lake initiative, where we're trying to increase the data sharing and ease of data sharing across different government departments. But we're thinking now that it finds itself at the intersection of this DPI journey, we can see how we can alleviate or elevate initiatives like that we've been undertaking as Treasury ourselves. That has grown from a long history of us being interested in using administrative data to inform policy and evidence-based policy and decision-making within our institution. We have invested in a national secure data facility where we house tax administrative data, which has produced a lot of interesting studies and informed a lot of policy decisions. We've also spatialized the data that we provide through that data facility, where we're able to produce aggregated statistics on economic indicators that municipalities, for example, are able to extract through an open access data portal so that they can inform their planning processes and policy making. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is the DPI journey is important both for services as well as evidence-based policy making and planning and budgeting.
Thank you. And one of the things that strikes me as you're saying that is often, so data is obviously fundamental to finance ministries the world over. Often you can caricature finance ministries as wanting to receive all the data, but not really share very much of it back. And so I'm really interested with what you were saying at the end there about providing that data back to municipalities and others. And I'm just wondering if there are particular drivers. That's a cultural shift for most most departments in most governments, but particularly finance ministries. And what's kind of triggered the willingness to make that shift?
So I think it's realizing the benefits of having multiple people analyzing certain data. So with the tax initiative, it started as us wanting to inform our own policies, but as we partnered with academia and other interested parties, the types of insights we're able to gain from data that was just used for administrative purposes unlocked a lot of opportunities for us. And that's why, as an institution, I think we're also going through a cultural change of trying to be more open about our data. I think the budget office and the budget information, we're quite transparent with that process, and we're trying to extend that into other areas as well. We're currently working towards being able to get to a point where we can publish our procurement data externally. So there's a huge drive within Treasury to just ensure that we are transparent about the data that we have, and we can make that available and easily accessible. For us, more analysis and more research and insights that we can gain from our different initiatives and the data and the decisions we're making, the better it is for us long term.
Thank you. Okay, so I think the time has come to turn it over to questions from the floor. David, did you have a follow-up? Yes.
I just wanted to say two quick things, just because I was so interested by what my colleagues were saying. Alors, premièrement, la chose que moi c'est fascinant, c'est que le moment que tu as commencé de parler d'une stratégie, tu as parlé des mêmes choses que moi je parlais. Tu as commencé avec, moi, on a besoin une identité unique pour chaque citoyen, on a besoin d'une façon de faire des paiements, et puis après ça, on a besoin d'un système de partager des données, même si ces données sont le focus est le ministère financier, mais on veut partager les données. Alors, toi, mon ami à ma gauche, il parlait des mêmes choses que moi je parlais. C'était intéressant pour moi. So I'm just quickly saying, like, his presentation was basically like, you didn't need me. Like, he basically said the same things I said, but in like, they're working on digital identity, payments, and a data exchange system as kind of central to their strategy. The other thing I just wanted to observe quickly, just to connect the conversation here to yesterday, is I am a big believer in like focusing on teams. One of the reasons that I came to thinking about infrastructure, though, was because even working with PD for the last 10 years, I've been getting together people who are kind of in government on those teams trying to do digital transformation. And there is a limit to what teams can do. And so I want to kind of just acknowledge that limits, but also understand how teams and infrastructure play together. So I think one of the dangers of teams is that you end up just being like, we're going to go send a team in to digitize every service. And that's like trench warfare. Like, you have to go do one service, and then the next service, and then the next service, and the next service. And there's like thousands of services across the government that you're going to have to digitize, and it will be endless. And so what you want is you want a team that is empowered and can go do that, but what you want them to be doing is starting to figure out the places where, as they're digitizing, what are the shared and common things that other teams might need too, so the next team doesn't have to repeat that work, and instead you turn it into infrastructure. So your infrastructure, in a way, is actually trying to reduce the amount of work that your teams need to do. So the teams, for me, are essential. They go do the discovery, they build the muscle, helping your government do transformation, but they shouldn't have just as their focus the digitization of the service. You want to have them thinking about how do they turn some of this work into an infrastructure layer that makes the work of the next team easier. And so I just want to connect this conversation with what I think is like the important advice from yesterday, which is building teams, but making sure you are connecting like today's ideas with yesterday's ideas really, really clearly.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the room? Yeah, I see one here. So start here, and then we'll go over to that table. Take maybe 3 questions, and then turn it to the panel.
Bonjour, ce ne serait pas une question, mais ce serait plutôt un complément de ce que M. Ouedraogo vient de partager avec l'audience. Alors, je voudrais ajouter que l'un des aspects qui a marqué donc le succès, notamment en termes donc des réformes, des projets, en termes de digitalisation au Burkina Faso, c'est la forte volonté politique qui est affichée au niveau donc du président, mais aussi au niveau donc du ministre des Finances. Alors, lorsqu'on constate au niveau du Burkina Faso, un des éléments, c'est qu'on a un comité de pilotage qui est mis en place. Et ce comité de pilotage a un regard assez rapproché du président de la République. Alors, ce qui fait que le ministre des Finances, et je pense que M. Ouedraogo qui est là, peut en témoigner, il peut être amené à venir répondre devant le président sur les échéances qu'il a fixées en termes donc de réalisation de ces projets de digitalisation. Et pour moi, ça, c'est un facteur très clé pour donc réussir dans les projets de digitalisation. Un autre élément qu'il faut noter, c'est aussi l'équipe, la qualité de l'équipe qui a été donc constituée pour conduire ces projets de digitalisation. Monsieur Ouedraogo qui est là, il a une double casquette. Il est en même temps expert en gestion des finances publiques, mais il est aussi un informaticien. Et pour moi, c'est un facteur très déterminant. Si vous prenez des ingénieurs en services informatiques pour être au cœur de ces changements en matière donc, de gestion des finances publiques, des projets de digitalisation, on ne va pas toujours aboutir. Mais il est toujours bon d'avoir le regard donc, des experts métiers et avoir des personnes qui ont une compétence comme M. Ouedraogo, une double casquette, une maîtrise donc, la gestion des finances publiques, en même temps une maîtrise donc, en matière de digitalisation est un facteur très essentiel pour pouvoir réussir ces projets de digitalisation. Alors, je parle aussi à ma qualité du président, d'ex-président du comité de suivi de ces projets de digitalisation pour dire que ce sont des facteurs qui nous ont permis d'avancer. Mais ce qui est important, et ça c'est une question que je pose donc aux panélistes, c'est que pendant que nous nous engageons à la transformation digitale, est-ce que nous nous projetons en termes donc de futur, dans 10 ans, dans 20 ans, pour ne pas avoir à reprendre ce que nous sommes en train d'engager, parce que c'est un secteur de transformation très rapide. Et l'autre élément qu'il faut noter, nous avons conduit tout récemment, et là maintenant je parle en tant que membre d'une institution africaine qui travaille dans le domaine de renforcement des capacités. Nous avons conduit tout récemment une recherche dans 6 pays. Et l'un des éléments en termes de besoins qui ont été donc soulignés par les participants en matière de gestion des finances publiques, c'est la considération de l'intelligence artificielle dans la gestion des finances publiques. Pour l'instant, ce n'est pas encore abordé dans nos pays. Bon, le cas de l'Afrique du Sud a été partagé, mais beaucoup de pays, ce n'est pas encore une préoccupation. Or, ça est dans nos administrations. Les gens les utilisent. Ça est au niveau de nos maisons, dans nos écoles. Mais comment est-ce que nous anticipons pour que ça ne devienne pas trop tard au regard de certains effets que ça pourrait avoir, que ce soit positif ou négatif, dans la gestion publique. Et pour moi, ce sont des facteurs très importants à prendre en considération. Et je voudrais avoir aussi le recul, ou j'allais dire l'analyse des panélistes sur ces questions-là. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Let's move to this table, get a couple more questions, and then we'll respond.
Thanks so much for that interesting conversation. My name is Ali Asgar. I'm from Open Cities Lab. 2 questions. First one for Ayanda specifically. Ayanda, in this journey of South Africa, very interesting to know and understand what have been the challenges that you have faced and how have you overcome this challenge in this journey to work on DPIs and making that the norm and working with so many different stakeholders, I think, who have such different and diverse needs, you know. The second question is a bit of a devil's advocate question. So South Africa has 3, what we call the triple challenges, right? Unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And yesterday we were talking about outcomes-based work. So whenever you do digital transformation, you do it to solve the problem, not to create some technology or something like that, right? So it's more about it's more about solving the problem than it is about creating the technology. So I'm actually afraid of asking this question because I think I might be thrown out if I ask it, but I'm just going to ask it still. So is DPI the silver bullet that is going to solve all the problems? Let's say in 5-10 years, we implement DPIs. Is it going to solve these 3 challenges? And is it that silver bullet that makes everything right suddenly? Thanks.
Hi, I am Prabhat Kumar from India. Is there a common understanding of characteristics of what DPI means and what it not? And in India, we have a lot of activities going in DPI, digital public good. And what does this mean? What it doesn't mean? We are also seeing some places where earlier we attempted with digital payment, and now we have gone back to a mix of cash plus digital. So, and I think building on the questions where how do we ensure equity and other lenses in the DPI work as well? Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I think we've got a really interesting comment and question about the kind of capabilities and I think engagement models and operating models for finance ministries in this space. Some specific questions about challenges in South Africa. Is DPI a silver bullet? And a sort of common understanding of what we're talking about here. I wonder if we might start on the end with the South Africa challenges.
Go for it. So I'll probably approach the answer to your question in two ways. One, I think in terms of the challenges we've faced, there are a lot of similar challenges across different entities because we haven't really had a unified attempt at establishing a DPI stack until now. So what we're doing as part of the roadmap process is mapping out all of those common challenges, grouping them and seeing how we can resolve them through the roadmap process so that we at least take into account that whatever systems you build need to take into account our connectivity, energy challenges. They need to take into account our skills and literacy levels. And when I say skills, it's just skills to actually build and maintain tech within departments. You'll know a lot of departments struggle and have such varying degrees of ICT maturity. Some struggle to, and some municipalities, let's say, will struggle to even have a uniform, some even emails, you know. I think that's just to show you how drastically different the resourcing and skills that's available within different government institutions. And so I think any roadmap you build is going to have to acknowledge those constraints. There's also issues that center around data standards, the quality of data that's maintained within systems. A lot of departments, even now, even without the DPI agenda, trying to get certain data from different entities can be very challenging in South Africa. Sometimes it's because there is no capability for them to extract the data from their systems, but sometimes it's also fear of what will be discovered because they don't even understand the data that they have within their systems. So there are a lot of hurdles that you need to overcome in terms of data standards, data cleaning, and building building metadata within departments and data catalogs. So there's a lot of groundwork that's required there. And then there are also legal barriers that we're going to have to face, you know. All of the MOUs that David had shown in that beautiful picture, I always love the impact of it. That's how we're sharing data and that's how everything is set up at the moment. But even within that, because of the PAPIA Act, for example, a lot of government departments had to halt projects that needed them to share data because of the fear of contravening the information regulators' requirements. So clarifying a lot of, you know, the enabling legislation that allows for data sharing across the state is going to be one of the key challenges that we also need to fix as we undertake this journey. Thanks.
So I wonder if you could just build on that a little bit with the sort of capabilities question of as you address those things, what sort of skills and capabilities are you needing to build within your team?
Yeah. So it's a difficult one, and I think we're playing around with a lot of ideas and trying to learn as well from international examples. One thing we can't get away from within government departments is that it's actually really difficult to source ICT skills and have them embedded within departments because of our pay structures. A lot of the packages that we offer as governments, in many cases, are not attractive to be able to keep those people full-time within our staffs. So it's finding agile ways of actually getting and attracting the skills that you need to be able to build future into the future, as opposed to using the traditional skills that we might have within departments. So I think it's finding a way to complement what we have internally as government and partnering as well with the private sector and other partners to be able to build all of the skills and literacy levels that we need. Some of it may be recruiting and you know, building new skills capabilities from young graduates and being able to, you know, build that within government. There've been ideas of having a center of excellence, for example, established so that you can build those kind of ICT services that can then be shared with other government departments. But I think it's a critical area for all of us to look at. In working with the confines of a public sector, I think it's different for some state-owned entities that don't have to follow the strict pay grades that, you know, government departments have to. At least with them, they're then able to source and you know, have an added bonus that they can put towards having those kinds of skills. But ultimately, it is important for us to actually integrate that and have it embedded within our government departments. There are a lot of efficiencies, process automation, a lot of work needs to be done within government departments. And for me, it doesn't help to build systems that can't be maintained, because using consultants, which is what we do at the moment, then mean when processes are handed over, they then aren't taken up long term. So there has to be a way of attracting new young talent to be able to hand over these processes to and run with it. And I think it's just a whole revamp of how government is viewed as not an old static body, but a futuristic entity that allows you to build skills and learn new skills by, you know, there's no other place you can get this kind of experience. I think that's how we need to start positioning government going forward.
Mr. Drago, it's obviously a compliment for you there, personally, and for the work that you're doing. I'd be really keen to get your reflection on that, again, on that capabilities piece particularly, and how you're thinking about building up those skills and the practices that you need, particularly where they might be different from what the finance ministries traditionally had.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Alors, on a constaté que les problèmes qu'on a rencontrés au niveau de la gestion des projets informatiques, comme ce que M. Bansé a dit tout à l'heure, résidaient dans les acteurs impliqués dans la mise en œuvre des projets. Plusieurs fois, on constate qu'on fait soit appel à des cabinets qui viennent réaliser le projet. Et à la fin, si on n'implique pas assez les acteurs concernés, une fois que le projet est terminé, alors on se rend compte que soit il n'y a pas assez d'acteurs parce qu'il n'y a pas eu de prise en main pour maintenir en bon état de fonctionnement le projet, le projet, ou bien que comme le projet a été fait sans l'implication des acteurs métiers, c'est un produit qui est là mais qu'on ne va pas utiliser. Alors, la nouvelle approche également qu'on est en train de faire pour minimiser un peu les difficultés dans ce sens, c'est de faire en sorte qu'on puisse avoir soit des équipes en interne pour mener à bien les projets informatiques, ou si on doit faire appel à des acteurs extérieurs, parce que ce n'est pas tout le temps qu'au niveau de l'administration, on a toutes les compétences, on fait en sorte que les acteurs internes soient fortement associés pour que d'ici la fin du projet, il y ait une prise en main suffisante pour faire en sorte que les acteurs internes puissent pouvoir maintenir le projet là à la fin de la mise en œuvre. Donc ça également, c'est des façons qu'on a en tout cas instituées à notre niveau pour faire en sorte que les projets informatiques là ne connaissent plus d'échecs, mais qu'on ait vraiment une bonne prise en main. Donc même si on a affaire à des cabinets ou des acteurs extérieurs qui viennent, ils viennent accompagner les équipes en interne et une fois que le projet est mis en place, on s'assure qu'il y a une bonne prise en main et une maîtrise des acteurs internes, ce qui fait que, bon, voilà, par la suite, le projet est géré de manière efficace. Donc, c'est cette stratégie également que je voulais ajouter pour dire que ça permet en tout cas d'accompagner le processus de numérisation, en tout cas de digitalisation dans l'administration de manière générale. Merci.
Thank you. And David, I think your body language made it clear you don't think DPI is a silver bullet. But I wondered if you could pick up the theme about, are we sufficiently clear in our definitions and common understanding, and perhaps touch on that. So it's not a silver bullet, but what does it mean for those crises and challenges?
Yeah, maybe just try to weave together a couple of things. So first, I wanted to tackle the question that was asked here, which is, are we digitizing right now in a way that's going to make us obsolete in 20 years? And the answer is yes, but that's not a reason not to do it. It's like these systems build on top of each other. You don't have internet without electricity. You don't have the web without internet. You don't have utility level storage and compute without the internet. Like these things do build on top of each other. And so like for me, an infrastructure approach is building on top of what's happened before. And whatever's coming next is also going to build on top. And so one of the things I get nervous about actually is like people talk about AI. I'm like, you don't get AI unless you've organized your data and you have a very strong understanding about how like you are institutionally formed from a digital perspective. And so doing this work is for me a kind of precondition in part to doing AI effectively and inclusively and fairly. So I see these things as building on each other. The other thing I would just say is I'm not really sure that there's, the DPI approach is really an effort to try to reflect both the way like internet era technologies have evolved and kind of some business models have evolved in other sectors. DPI in some ways is not like a new, it's maybe a new way of framing things, but it's reflecting a set of practices that I think have been emergent for 20 or 30 years now. And so I don't want my governments doing new things. I don't want them to be slow adopters. I'd like them to be responsible adopters of what works. And so I think DPI is an effort to look across the landscape and say, hey, look, the world has moved in these ways. Like most modern companies are organizing themselves along these principles. How should we be adopting that for the public sector? How should we be adopting that in government and trying to reflect on that? I don't think DPI is a silver bullet in the same way that like electricity is not a silver bullet. Like electricity has not solved all of our problems, but I don't think anyone's like looking to a world to go back to like no electricity. Like it has created all sorts of capabilities and it has solved all sorts of problems. It's also created some new problems, but it's solved all sorts of problems. And I think that's the way we should be thinking about DPI is it's not necessarily a silver bullet that's going to solve everything, but it is a way of trying to think about how to organize ourselves in a way that will give us capabilities to solve a lot of problems at scale. And the reason why I get excited about the kind of DPI approach is central to DPI is the public in DPI, the public in digital public infrastructure. The challenge for me is I think this stuff is going to happen either way. The choice in front of us is not, are you going to escape the 21st century with or without a digital ID? The question is going to be, what is the governance of that digital ID? The question is not, are you going to get out of the 21st century without a digital payment system of some form? The question is, what is the governance of that digital payment system? And is that system going to be privately controlled by monopoly actors who can extract rents? Or is it going to be done in a way that tries to maximize inclusion, maximize the policy objectives of your society, whether that's reducing rent or reducing monopoly or increasing economic development or ensuring resilience? Like the question in front of us are ones of governance and choice around how we want these technologies to serve our societies effectively. And so for me, the kind of central part of the definition of DPI is we can debate as like, is it identity versus is it kind of thinking about components? But really this, for me, is a conversation about governance. Are we choosing to create systems that are maximizing for inclusivity and access? And therefore, is there a public interest element in this that we want to place at the heart of how we're doing this work? And that may mean government control. It may mean private sector operation and even private sector control with a lot of oversight from government. But what is the governance that we're going to choose for this, regardless where it lives and who does it? That, for me, is the central debate around DPI. And I don't want to really get lost in the kind of like the technical discussions about is it this technology or that technology, because I think that's actually kind of secondary. I hope that's helpful.
Merci. Alors, là-dessus, je voudrais ajouter que, alors, ce qui change rapidement dans ce domaine, c'est la technologie peut-être qui change rapidement, mais le service attendu aux citoyens ne change pas trop. Donc, ça veut dire que la base, il faut avoir une bonne stratégie. Qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire et construire cette stratégie-là? Comme ça, peut-être dans 5 ans, 10 ans, c'est la manière de faire qui va changer, mais le regard fondamental ne changera pas. Alors qu'en matière informatique, c'est juste la technologie. Demain, aujourd'hui, on utilise une technologie. Demain, on trouve une autre technologie qui permet d'aller vite. C'est cette technologie qu'on change, mais soigner les gens, faire en sorte que les gens puissent payer l'impôt ne changera pas fondamentalement. Donc, pour moi, il faut construire une base stratégique sur plusieurs années. Même si la technologie change, on s'adaptera parce qu'on aura un système souple, mais on ne reviendra pas en arrière parce que peut-être on n'avait pas vu tel ou tel aspect. Merci.
Moi, j'aimais ça tellement que je voulais ajouter aussi. C'est comme, pour moi, la chose qu'on fait ici, c'est qu'on est en train de développer des muscles. C'est pas quand on veut une stratégie ou quand on veut une implémentation d'un format ou d'un autre format. C'est quand on veut une équipe, parce que cette équipe représente des muscles qu'on peut utiliser pour s'adapter à n'importe quoi qui arrive, à nous confronter d'une forme technologique. The point here is we're trying to build muscles. Like these teams that the PD team and the ODI team is talking about is these are muscles that we can be using to help us adapt to any technology future. And like that's the state capability we need to be building. So I see teams and infrastructure, these are state capabilities that allow us to adapt for any future that's coming to us. And so don't try to game to figure out what the future holds and what technology is coming. Let's build state capability to allow us to be effective in a digital era, regardless of what technology is coming our way.
Thank you. Lots of themes to respond to there. I'd like to go back to the floor and start with Frederic.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to the point you just made, David, and in your introduction, and maybe here as well, from the country experience about the role of a private sector developing this solution. And if it's all about governance, maybe there should be just as much focus on the governance and the public interest of privately developed solutions. So I'd like to understand what you have seen and perhaps the experience in South Africa and Burkina Faso about involving the private sector, developing and managing solutions that serve the public interest.
Thank you very much. I'm Alai Bara from the Gambia. Just a quick question. You discussed about governance and data sharing, access to information for service delivery, of course, and also to support policy. My question is, to what extent do we take on board the issue of data security during this process of DPI? Thank you.
Any others? Richard.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Richard from the internet. To Ayanda, I wonder just a question of, in addition to how much we can pay people, is it not also that we make technical people become managers? There's no structure in government to let someone become more and more senior without making them a manager. And how much would that help if we were actually able to let someone be a specialist in digital technology, maybe to the panel? And secondly, to sort of ask, build more on what David's talking about. How much is it big digital or big government? Like big D or big G? Because I hear a lot about building teams and components and infrastructure, but to what degree is service design actually the part of the thing that the demand pull that talks to your governance point? Because one of the things that concerns me is efficiency is a trap, and a lot of the way this can go is making government more efficient without actually having any end impact on someone's life. So how do you build in the safeguards to say that the approaches like electricity, like Because we see with electricity how many people don't have electricity. We see with DPI like a lot of things around government kind of thinking. So how do you build in the safeguard to say it does end up changing someone's life, and it does end up changing the most vulnerable, hidden and marginalized lives within the way we're thinking around like this kind of approach?
Thank you. I know we have some questions online as well, so maybe if we get a couple of those, and then I'll try and recap for the panel.
Bonjour.
Yeah, can I? We have one question. We have one question from the online audience. It speaks to one of David's earlier points. How can finance ministries strategically balance the need for open and inclusive digital public infrastructure with the challenges of ensuring data privacy, security, and regulatory compliance, especially when collaborating with the private sector and other stakeholders?
Great, thank you. I'm going to go through these, and then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for some more, or if not, I know everybody will be around afterwards for further conversation. But yeah, so actually some themes emerging from those questions. I was particularly hearing the kind of the role of the private sector, and then that sort of particularly steps into some of the regulatory and security and other considerations as you collaborate. Sort of just internally, how to think about some of those details of governance around security, privacy, and so on. And then, this questions about both how do we provide viable career paths for the sorts of people that we might want for this work, but also what's the role of service design in what we're talking about. I wonder if we might just sort of come down the panel responding to that.
I'll kick us off. I'll start with the role of the private sector in all of this and tag it along with the data security question. I think the private sector has an important role to play. One, because in South Africa especially, a lot of our systems the legacy systems that we use, your SAP systems and various packages and solutions, or off-the-shelf solutions that different municipalities and some provincial departments use as well, mean that the private sector is always a key consideration. I do think, and I think David made this point quite well as well in his reflections, it's important to decide what is more important. Is it ensuring that you build up the skills to be able to build your own bespoke systems, and what are the implications of not doing that? It means that you essentially sign on to evergreen contracts with certain service providers, where you then run into vendor lock-in, and not having the flexibility to actually dictate how you want your digital transformation to look, and you're almost restricted to what the solutions that the private sector offers can do. I'm not saying that there isn't scope to negotiate with them so that you can tailor those a little bit more to what we need as a country, for example, but it does actually make it really difficult. We've had a lot of experiences on the legal challenges of engaging and running those procurement processes. It's a very challenging world to navigate. So I do think that DPI offers us a chance to re-establish the rules of engagement, have a clearer understanding as government on what you actually want and what you want your systems to deliver for you, and have a voice as opposed to picking what is available. And I think that that's an important way to look at how you can include the private sector. They can definitely help us shape certain things, but government should maintain control of where they want, where they think they see the private sector participating, and not necessarily having the private sector drive the whole conversation. And I think that's going to be a really key issue as well, even with the DPI roadmap that we're developing. And I think that's why it's so well positioned under Operation Vulindlela, because where it's required, there's scope, to make recommendations on exemptions if there need to be exemptions that are put in place, and different ways of running through procurement processes overall. So it will be really interesting to see what that process puts out as key recommendations. And then in terms of data security, for me it always boils down to a conversation around trust. You have to build trust. There's a lot of trust that's needed to be built just on people adopting technology, trust between government institutions. Can you treat the data that I give you well, or are there going to be breaches? We've had a lot of cybersecurity issues with the various entities. So I think as part of DPI, a really critical component of it is the safeguards that we put in place to ensure that we don't lose that trust with society, between ourselves as government departments. And that's why it has to be really key on our agenda. But I do think in many ways, one of the colleagues, Richard actually, loves saying that there is no counterfactual for not having in place an electronic digital system. The loopholes and the gaps that you have embedded within your process by it being manual, it's difficult to quantify that compared to the risks that you open up yourself to through moving to a digital path. But it's important to move to it nonetheless, because I think it's easier to set the ground rules for that, and the safeguards that you need in place to ensure that there's a safe way of sharing data between the state and with the private sector. I also think it's an important comment on whether we should revisit looking at having specialist tracks within the public sector. I think it should be at the heart of the conversation around skills development, and I think DPSA has a role there as well. Within they've also put in a drive to look at more data governance and data management within government departments, but I think the skills to actually handle data and build all of the tech that we need as government departments should really be thought of more long term, and so I think it's definitely something that should be considered.
Ok, merci. En fait, je voulais revenir sur les aspects de sécurité et du rôle du privé. Alors, pour ce qui concerne le rôle du privé, le privé doit jouer un rôle très important parce que l'État ne peut pas tout faire. Si je prends le cas, par exemple, du Burkina Faso, la numérisation totale des services implique l'accès à Internet ou à une technologie qui permet d'avoir accès à ce e-service. Et l'État ne peut pas tout faire. Nous, on a ce qu'on appelle le backbone national, qui est en fait l'infrastructure que l'État a mis en place, mais dans le pays, ça s'arrête souvent au niveau des chefs-lieux de région. Donc, au niveau de ces infrastructures-là, c'est le privé qui prend souvent la relève pour amener la connexion depuis le nœud au niveau de la région jusqu'aux extrémités souvent. Donc, ce rôle-là est très important au niveau de l'infrastructure. Maintenant, il faut voir comment définir le contrat ou les clauses entre l'État et le privé pour s'assurer que le privé gagne parce qu'eux, ils cherchent du bénéfice, mais que l'État gagne parce que le service qu'il doit rendre aux citoyens, le privé permet de le faire. Au niveau applicatif, au niveau soft également, il y a des moments où l'État n'a pas l'ensemble des compétences pour développer certains services. Et donc là également, on fait appel au privé à travers des contrats pour bénéficier de son expertise. Donc l'État a un rôle d'accompagner le privé pour pouvoir former en tout cas les acteurs dont il aura besoin pour l'écosystème et maintenant voir comment contractuellement faire un partenariat avec ce privé-là pour pouvoir avoir ce partenariat gagnant-gagnant. Donc c'est ce que je voulais dire pour le rôle du privé. Alors maintenant pour l'équilibre entre la législation, les données à caractère personnel. Alors, je pense qu'il faut voir qu'est-ce qui est important. Voilà, il faut voir focus, qu'est-ce qu'on veut. Si ce qu'on veut, c'est vraiment faire en sorte qu'on puisse aller vers l'utilisation du numérique, je pense que la législation doit évoluer pour prendre en compte cette donne-là. Et pour le cas du Burkina, à chaque fois qu'on met en place une application qui doit faire appel à des données à caractère personnel, on a l'application qui est chargée de ça, qu'on appelle le SIL, voilà, qui est associée à tout moment pour s'assurer on est toujours dans cet équilibre-là pour qu'il n'y ait pas d'abus. Mais pour moi, en tout cas, la législation, on ne doit pas rester sur les anciennes législations. On doit pouvoir être flexible et prendre en compte l'aspect numérique dans notre législation aujourd'hui. Merci.
Okay, several things I want to respond to. Some of I feel were directed very much at me, so I feel I better respond to them. So first, just quickly on promoting people. I have a thing I've created with a number of faculty around the world called Teaching Public Service in a Digital Age, and it's really thinking about what are the minimum viable skills and knowledge about technology public leaders should have to be effective in their role. And I don't think, like, if our belief is that in the future, every public servant has to be like a data scientist or a software engineer, we're hooped. Like, that's not gonna happen. Like, even the tech companies can't find enough software engineers and data scientists, so the notion that we're gonna suddenly have enough for everybody, including the public sector, is not realistic. I'm much more interested in what the minimum viable knowledge is, and I'm much more interested in having more senior people with operational experience in government. I think the policy people, and frankly the economists, play a very heavy role, and there's actually been an exclusion of people with more and more operational experience that's so essential to doing this work. The second thing I just want to comment on coming from this side of the room was, I don't think efficiency is a trap. I think we're conflating things. I don't want to conflate infrastructure with service delivery. Infrastructure, I really want my grid operators to be obsessed with efficiency. I want a hyper efficient electrical grid. And I want them to be laser focused on increasing the efficiency of that grid. Now, the appliances that I put on top of that grid, I would like to have be really user-friendly and really focused on my user journey, so that when I pick up a hairdryer or a computer or whatever you're plugging in to the electrical grid, it's so intuitive for me to use, I don't need an instruction manual. But don't confuse these two things. Your horizontal infrastructure is about enabling 1,000 new things to be built on top of it. Those things have really good user design to them. But that doesn't mean that the infrastructure shouldn't have but needs to have a heavy investment of user design. Quite the opposite. I want it to be hyper efficiency focused. When it comes to thinking about kind of privacy and security, I want to abstract you up a level and just have you focus on what we're really trying to drive towards, which is trust. We don't care about privacy for the sake of privacy, or I don't think we do. I think there are people out there who make that argument. What we're really concerned about is, do people have trust and confidence in the services that governments or whoever is provisioning? And what I sometimes worried about is we get confused about the core interest of trust and accountability with mechanisms that we think achieve those. And I say this having learned this lesson very painfully. I cut my teeth in the open data and kind of the open movement period. And I, to some degree, and some people to a strong degree, and I believe that like transparency necessarily means better governance. Transparency and better governance are not correlated. Transparency can be a mechanism to better governance. Transparency can also be used as a means to create worse governance. So, like, this notion that like everybody wants 100% privacy of all of their data all of the time, I just don't think is factually true. People consent all the time, and sometimes don't even consent to have their data be used to make their lives better, and are grateful for it when it's done by institutions that they trust. They become more concerned and frustrated when it's been done by institutions that they don't trust. So the core thing first here is I just want us to recognize we're really interested in trust. And what I don't want us to do is to sacrifice the ability for us to use information to better provision and create public goods, because we are yielding to this notion that everything has to be privacy focused and no one's allowed to do anything with anyone else's data anywhere, anytime. People actually want to live better lives and are willing to make trade-offs. But that means we have to earn that trust, and we have to create regulatory regimes that facilitate that trust. I think right now we have these regimes where like no data can be shared between any two ministries anytime, like in many countries, and we think that that builds trust. I believe actually it might be eroding confidence in government. Because people are like, you are unable to deliver services to me as effectively as, like, say, a private sector company can, because that private sector company is able to share data. And so we have to be, I think we need to have a very significant conversation about what we're actually trying to drive for, and not simply pattern ourselves after achieving a set of notions around privacy and security that kind of satisfy an abstract notion about what we think is right versus what's actually serving public interest. And I recognize that that's not going to be a popular statement with everybody, but I think that's the real conversation. So then, yes, I would love for us to have like security policies and privacy policies that we're adhering to that make sure that we're on rails that like support trust and security, but aren't doing so for kind of reasons of kind of theater, but are actually doing those that actually make people more secure, but also increase their trust in us and enable us to provision services more effectively. Final thing I'd just say on the role of the private sector is again, like the electrical grid is always the example I like to come back to. So here in this country, you have ESCOM, you have a national energy provider. So maybe it's going to be in some countries that we have governments that are operating and running these systems, because that's what people trust and that's what people want. But in many countries, you have private sectors running it, but the public sector provides oversight and guidance about what's possible and what's not possible. So in most countries where the private sector runs the electrical grid, the electrical company just can't cut your energy the moment you fail to pay the bill for the first time, because getting electricity is so important to you fulfilling so many other functions and duties in society that we create like an ombudsperson role, and we make it hard to turn off your electricity, and you really have to like stumble quite hard to do that. Left to its own devices, the private sector might not make that choice, but we've decided that because electricity is so important, it's so critical, that inclusion, safety, access are at the heart of how that service has to be provisioned. And so whether you're a private sector actor or a private sector actor, you have to adhere to the set of rules that we create. That's how I think we should be thinking about infrastructure in the digital era as well. What is the governance set of rules that we want to create that prioritize access, prioritize inclusion, prioritize safety and trust? And then maybe there'll be private provision of that, maybe there'll be public provision of that, but how do we do that in a way that ensures competition and access and inclusion at all times?
Thank you. I'm conscious there are more questions in the room, but it's also definitely time for our coffee break. Hopefully many of these conversations will spill over coffee, and many of the themes will be picked up in sessions later in the day. So to wrap us up, I just wanted to go back this way along the panel. Are there just one or two very quick thoughts on what should be front of mind for finance ministries as they think about this agenda?
Yeah, I want to come back to, whether you realize it or not, the finance ministries don't shape government, but they hold the veto card over what the form and structure of government looks like. And in a digital era, we're trying to reimagine what government might look like, and I think it's going to require some horizontal thinking and some different ways of organizing ourselves. And you effectively hold a veto card, and currently are making funding decisions that are reinforcing a status quo that is, I would argue, inefficient and making it harder for us to transform. And so I would love to know what we can do to engage you to move away from that status quo and make the transformation easier for everybody.
Any concluding thoughts?
I guess in closing from my perspective, it's just to highlight that, you know, I think the Ministry of Finance definitely has a key role, which is why the National Treasury of South Africa is so involved in Operation Vulindlela, unlocking structural reforms, including the DPI agenda, and we'll continue to support it because we fundamentally need to wrap our heads around, as the Ministry of Finance, how we the cost of the implementation, building, and maintenance of DPI, but more importantly, ensuring that, you know, as a country, we are cognizant of the financing decisions and the funding models that we undertake in this journey. From my perspective, what's really key for us to get out of this process is what should actually sit with the state and what should be allocated to donors and other private players, and what are the rules that they should engage with. And so that's our interest as the Ministry of Finance and why we're so involved in all of this. And hopefully when you come back to us in a few years, South Africa will have leapfrogged and adopted a lot of what we're talking about today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Plenty to discuss as we head out to coffee. But for now, thank you all for your attention and engagement and great questions. And please join me in thanking the panel. And